Dear Mr. Harper, you and your hard conservative heart, you and me feel differently about our country, but one thing that is plain to see is that the economy is at an all-time low. And you and I don't see eye to eye, but we can both see that voter apathy is at an all-time high. Dear Mr. Harper, 58% of eligible voters elected you a minority government, so just keep in mind that you don't represent most of the people in this country. You actually represent 49% of the 58% of the people who actually bothered to vote, which is a lot less than half. And if you actually bother to do the math, Mr. Harper, you'd realize that when you say the people of Canada have given you a clear message, and when you presume to assume the role of the voice who represents our country, it's bullshit, Mr. Harper, because only 49% of the 58% of the people of Canada have put their confidence in you, and probably most of those people just didn't know what else to do this time around. Since you had to dissolve the last parliament because of lack of confidence, frankly, I don't know how anybody has any confidence left anymore. Oh, Mr. Harper, I keep harping and harping, harping and harping. You say, why do you artists keep harping and harping, asking for handouts and asking for funding, asking for a percentage of taxpayers' money, saying how what we do and who we are has nothing to do with ordinary Canadians? But, Mr. Harper, in all honesty, who among us strives actually to be ordinary? Who is this ordinary Canadian that you keep referring to? Certainly not you, Mr. Harper. As Prime Minister, you're obviously not interested in an ordinary life. You're interested in having your say and having your voice heard above the throng. In fact, you keep the throng muzzled so that your song is the only song that gets sung. Your agenda is the only one that gets heard, that everyone bows to. And even though you are obviously currently leading a minority, your policies in regard to immigration and artists and single parents and women and young offenders and gays and lesbians, to name just a few that I could mention, your policies make it clear, Mr. Harper, that you don't actually care for minorities, do you, Mr. Harper? You're not used to thinking of yourself as a minority, are you, Mr. Harper? And when you say, God bless Canada, Mr. Harper, it makes me think about your religion and how strange and ironic it is that your brand of fundamentalist Christians seem to me to be the furthest of anybody from practicing the ideas that Jesus was actually preaching. Yeah, Mr. Harper, if you looked a little deeper at his teaching, you'd find that Jesus was a social revolutionary, a utopic visionary, a man who believed in equality, whose ideology was probably closer to that of the NDP or the Green Party than your brand of social neoconservatives, where Christian morality seems to be confused with a capitalist mentality, where the idea of spiritual freedom seems to be confused with the free market. Oh, Mr. Harper, you and your hard conservative heart, and your little sweater vesters, trying to look the part, trying to look like Dad, you make me so mad, Mr. Harper. I keep harping and harping. I can't help it, Mr. Harper. I keep harping and harping. Look around us here in this crisis of civilization, this population explosion, this stock market implosion, global warming, poverty, persisting, dwindling social programming, corporate corrupting. Nice work with your little apology to the Aboriginal community. Nice work with the cutting of funding to the National Action Committee on the Status of Women. Nice work with the $500 tax credit you've promised families for music lessons. Nice work cutting the funding for Canadian artists to travel abroad, so that families who can afford music lessons to begin with get a little something back. Meanwhile, you launch an all-out economic attack on the artists who persist, who insist that they should be recognized as having a legitimate career, who persevere despite the fact that they are on the lowest economic rung. They work as hard as anyone, and their work represents Canada around the world. And you have the audacity, Mr. Harper, to question whether their work matters, presume that they should work for free, like it has no bearing on the economy, like art is something that you could take or leave, and should probably leave. Presumably you thought Margaret Atwood's little letter to you published in the Globe and Mail a few weeks ago was just fabricated bullshit, if you ever even read it, Mr. Harper. Maybe you don't read, maybe you deem that to be an activity the ordinary people don't care for. But her point seemed clear to me, that arts and culture generate more than $46 billion, or 3.8% of the Canadian GDP annually. But anyway, it sure is funny that we call these political parties parties. Doesn't seem like much of a party to me. Doesn't really look like such a good time to me. Looks about as much like a party, in fact, as any of my hard-working artist friends look like they are sipping expensive drinks at fancy receptions on the taxpayer's dime. And I know that it's not that you're having a good time, Mr. Harper. I know you have a hard and serious job, Mr. Harper. It probably doesn't feel like much of a party. It's a lot of responsibility to be running a country with such a marginal percentage of the ordinary Canadian population actually supporting you and your minority. Mr. Harper, I'm sorry I keep harping and harping. It's just that I want you to give a shit about me. It's just that I want you to get a grip. I want you to see another point of view. Mr. Harper, I wish I knew where to aim my arrow to pierce your hard, conservative heart. It's not that I want to kill you with my dart. I just want to make a dent, a small rent. I want to be able to convince you somehow with my art. But I'm afraid that nothing and no one will ever get through to you, and that I'll be left over here on the left, wondering what to do besides harping and harpering, harping and harpering, harping and harpering. Mr. Harper.